The manila envelope slipped from my trembling fingers, scattering decades-old bank statements across my mother's mahogany desk like accusations made of paper. My knees buckled, and I gripped the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles turned ashen beneath my brown skin. The numbers blazed in my mind. $47,000 withdrawn in 1979, the same year I'd received that thin rejection letter from Howard University citing insufficient funds. Good day, everyone. I am grateful you are here with me. Before we begin, I would really love to know where you are watching from. Comment your city below. Now, let me tell you about something that changed my life forever. I dropped into the leather chair, its familiar creak now sounding like mockery. My hands shook as I spread the documents before me, each one a piece of the puzzle I'd never wanted to solve. The Lake Tahoe property deed. Transfer documents dated August 15, 1979. Purchase price, $47,000. My chest tightened, ribs constricting around lungs that suddenly forgot how to pull in air. The funeral had been 3 days ago. I'd stood in my black dress, holding my father's hand as they lowered my mother into the ground, believing I was the devoted daughter who'd sacrificed her dreams to work at the post office. The daughter who never questioned why the college fund vanished. The daughter who swallowed the story about the stock market crash eating their savings. I snatched up another statement, my reading glasses sliding down my nose. My grandmother's handwriting covered a letter tucked between the pages, spidery cursive on yellowed stationery. I read it once, then twice, my throat closing with each word. She'd sent them money specifically for my education, every month for 8 years. The dates aligned perfectly with deposits into an account I'd never known existed. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times. Its deep tone vibrated through the floorboards, through the Persian rug my parents had bought during one of their many trips to that lake house. I'd helped them load furniture into moving trucks for that place. I'd smiled and waved as they drove off for summer weekends while I worked double shifts sorting mail in a sweltering warehouse. My phone buzzed against the desk. I glanced at the screen. My father calling from the rehabilitation center where he'd been staying since his stroke last month. My thumb hovered over the answer button, then moved to silence it. The device continued vibrating, dancing across the polished wood surface, until it finally went still. I stood and walked to the window, my reflection ghostly in the darkening glass. 64 years old, retirement looming in 6 months, a studio apartment in a building where sirens were the lullaby. No degree, no husband, no children. I'd told myself for decades that I'd made peace with my life, that I'd built something meaningful from the scraps I'd been given. The stack of photo albums sat on the shelf beneath the window. I yanked the top one down, flipping pages with increasing violence. There they were, my parents laughing on a dock, mountains reflected in still water behind them. My mother, in a sundress, younger than I was now, holding a glass of wine on a cedar deck. My father grilling steaks, that lake house looming behind him with its floor-to-ceiling windows and wraparound porch. I'd never been invited there. Not once in 45 years. The album slammed shut with enough force to crack the spine. My hands shook as I shoved it back onto the shelf, knocking 3 others to the floor. I left them there, pages splayed open, and grabbed my coat from the chair. The buttons fought me, my fingers too rigid to cooperate. I gave up halfway and threw the coat over my shoulders instead. The keys jangled against my palm as I locked the apartment door. Mrs. Chen from across the hall poked her head out, her usual friendly smile faltering when she saw my face. I turned away before she could speak, taking the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator. 5 flights down, my knees protesting each step, but the pain felt appropriate. The burn in my thighs matched the fire in my chest. Outside, the November wind cut through my unbuttoned coat. I walked 3 blocks to the bus stop, then kept walking. 7 more blocks to the parking garage where I kept my 15-year-old Honda. The attendant barely glanced up as I passed his booth. My hands gripped the steering wheel before I even started the engine, knuckles bleaching white against the dark leather. The rehabilitation center sat 40 minutes away in a suburb I'd visited 6 times in the past month. Each visit had been the same, me sitting beside the hospital bed, making small talk about nothing, avoiding everything. I'd brought magazines he didn't read. I'd updated him on neighbors he didn't remember. I'd pretended we were a normal family having normal conversations. Traffic lights blurred past. I rolled through a yellow that turned red halfway across the intersection. A horn blared behind me. I pressed the accelerator harder. The parking lot was nearly empty at this hour, visiting time almost over. I sat in the car with the engine running, heat blasting from the vents, watching my breath fog the windshield despite the warm air. My phone showed 3 missed calls now. 2 from my father, 1 from my mother. The automatic doors of the center whooshed open as I approached. Antiseptic smell mixed with institutional dinner, overcooked vegetables and mystery meat. The nurse at the front desk recognized me, waving me through without checking my ID. Her smile was practiced, professional. I wondered what she saw in my face that made her look away so quickly. Room 237, 2nd floor. The elevator climb felt like descending instead. The hallway stretched impossibly long, fluorescent lights humming overhead in that specific frequency that triggered headaches. My feet moved forward anyway, carrying me past identical doors with identical nameplates until I reached his. Through the narrow window, I could see him propped up in bed, remote control in his good hand, watching a game show. His left side remained motionless, the stroke having claimed his dominant arm and leg. He looked smaller than I remembered from my last visit 3 days ago. Smaller and older and frighteningly fragile. My hand touched the door handle, cold metal against my palm. I stood there breathing, watching him through the glass, knowing that once I crossed this threshold, everything would change. The careful dance we'd performed for 45 years would end. The polite fiction of our relationship would shatter. He turned his head toward the door, sensing someone outside. Our eyes met through the glass. His face brightened in that automatic way parents' faces brighten when they see their children, that involuntary response that has nothing to do with whether they deserve to feel that joy. I pushed the door open. It swung on oiled hinges, silent and smooth. The game show volume seemed too loud, a contestant squealing over winning a dining room set. My father fumbled for the remote with his working hand, fingers slipping on the buttons until he found mute. "Cynthia, sweetheart. I was worried when you didn't answer." His voice came out slurred on one side, the stroke having stolen some of his clarity along with his mobility. I walked to the chair beside his bed, the same chair I'd occupied 6 times before, and remained standing. The envelope in my purse seemed to pulse against my hip like a second heartbeat. I lowered myself into the vinyl chair, feeling the familiar crack in the left armrest dig into my palm. The room smelled of disinfectant and something else, decay masked by artificial lavender. Medical equipment beeped from the hallway, a steady rhythm that made my jaw clench tighter. My father's good hand reached toward me, fingers trembling slightly. I watched those fingers, remembering how they used to grip golf clubs, sign checks, pat my shoulder at high school graduation, while his eyes looked past me toward the country club bar. I kept my hands folded in my lap. "How are you feeling?" The words came out mechanical, rehearsed. "Better now that you're here." His smile wobbled at the edges where the stroke had weakened the muscles. "The therapist says I might walk again with enough work." I nodded once, feeling the envelope's weight shift as I leaned forward. Through the window, clouds moved across the late afternoon sun, throwing shadows that crawled across the linoleum floor. My thumbnail dug into my index finger, creating a white crescent in the skin. The bank documents had arrived yesterday. Thick, cream-colored paper with embossed letterhead. Statements dating back 23 years. Account numbers that matched the ones from my acceptance letter to Howard University. Deposits made quarterly from my grandmother's trust, meant for tuition, room, board, books. Withdrawals beginning 6 months after she died, systematic and steady, bleeding the account dry over 18 months. My father shifted in the bed, the sheets rustling. He winced, touching his paralyzed arm with his functioning hand, adjusting it like a separate object that no longer belonged to him. The television screen reflected in his glasses, the muted game show contestants jumping and hugging in silence. "Your mother should be here soon." He glanced at the wall clock, then back to me. "She's bringing dinner from that Italian place you like." My teeth ground together hard enough to make my jaw ache. The Italian place closed 7 years ago. I'd mentioned this twice during previous visits. He nodded, as if he'd known all along, but his eyes flickered with confusion before settling back into that practiced expression of paternal authority. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound like tearing fabric. My legs carried me to the window, where I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. 4 stories down, visitors crossed the parking lot, carrying flowers and balloons, their faces small and indistinct. A woman in scrubs smoked a cigarette near the ambulance bay, her breath mixing with the smoke in visible clouds. Behind me, my father's breathing changed, becoming shallower. I could feel his confusion radiating across the small room, filling the space between us like humidity before a storm. My reflection stared back at me from the darkening window, my face set in hard lines that reminded me too much of his own stubborn expression. The envelope emerged from my purse slowly. I held it against my thigh, feeling the thickness of the papers inside, the evidence of betrayal reduced to bank statements and property records. My fingers left moisture marks on the manila surface. "Cynthia? What's wrong, sweetheart?" The endearment scraped against my spine like fingernails on slate. I turned from the window, envelope still clutched against my leg. He looked so diminished in the hospital bed, his body failing him the way he'd failed me. But there was no satisfaction in his weakness, only a hollow ache that made my chest feel packed with stones. I walked back to the bed, my footsteps deliberate, measured. The envelope landed on his blanket-covered lap with barely a sound, but he flinched as if I'd thrown something heavy. His good hand moved to touch it, then stopped. "What's this?" My arms crossed over my chest, hands gripping my biceps hard enough to bruise. "Open it." His fingers fumbled with the envelope clasp, the tremor in his hand making the simple task look like defusing a bomb. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening every line and hollow. I watched his eyes track across the first page, then the second, his pupils moving in small jerks as the numbers registered. The pages slipped from his grip, fanning across the white blanket like cards from a crooked deck. His chest rose and fell twice before he looked up at me, his mouth opening without sound. The heart monitor's beeping seemed to accelerate, each chirp marking another second of his comprehension. "Baby, let me explain." I raised one hand, palm out, cutting through the air between us. The gesture silenced him more effectively than any words. My other hand reached into my purse again, this time pulling out my phone. My fingers moved across the screen, pulling up the saved images, the evidence I'd compiled over 3 weeks of digging through public records and bank statements. The phone landed beside the papers on his lap. On the screen, a real estate listing glowed. A lakefront property with a wraparound deck, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a private dock. I'd memorized every detail of that house, every feature they'd purchased with money meant for my education. The listing price matched my college fund almost exactly, right down to the 18 years of accumulated interest. His good hand covered the phone screen, as if hiding the image could erase what he'd done. A wet, rasping sound came from his throat. I stepped back, my hip bumping against the visitor's chair, needing more distance from his mounting distress. The door burst open behind me. My mother swept in carrying 2 coffee cups, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. She stopped 3 steps into the room, her eyes tracking from my rigid posture to the papers scattered across my father's lap to the phone still clutched in his shaking hand. "Cynthia, what's going on?" The coffee cups landed on the bedside table with a clatter, brown liquid sloshing over the rims. I turned to face her fully, shoulders back, chin lifted. Her perfectly composed expression began to crack around the edges as she registered the fury that must have been written across every feature of my face. My jaw ached from clenching my teeth so hard. "She knows," my father whispered, his voice breaking on the second word. "About the lake house." The color drained from my mother's face, leaving her foundation looking thick and artificial against her suddenly gray pallor. Her hands rose to her throat, fingers pressing against the pearl necklace she always wore, a nervous habit I'd observed for 6 decades. She took a step toward the bed, then stopped, her gaze darting between my father and me like a trapped animal seeking escape. I moved to the foot of the bed, gripping the metal railing hard enough to make my knuckles pale. The cold steel bit into my palms, anchoring me as rage rolled through my chest in waves. My mother's reflection in the window showed her mouth opening and closing, searching for words that wouldn't come. "How long have you been back there?" The question came out flat, emotionless. I watched my mother's face crumble, watched her realize I'd found their secret sanctuary, had seen the place they'd built with my future. She sank into the visitor's chair, her legs seeming to give out beneath her weight. Her perfectly manicured hands covered her face, and her shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. But I felt nothing watching her grief, just the same hollow emptiness that had filled me since discovering the truth. My father tried to sit up straighter, wincing as pain shot through his weakened body. "We were going to tell you." "When?" The word cracked through the room like a whip. Both of them flinched. "Before or after I'd worked 3 jobs to put myself through community college? Before or after I'd given up my scholarship to state because I couldn't afford the housing?" My mother's head snapped up, mascara streaking down her cheeks in black rivers. She lurched forward in the chair, gripping the armrests until the leather squeaked beneath her fingers. Her mouth worked silently for several seconds before sound emerged. "That scholarship was only partial." I crossed the small room in 3 strides, my orthopedic shoes squeaking against the linoleum. The IV stand clattered as I bumped it, sending the bag of fluids swinging. My shadow fell across both of them, and I saw my father's eyes widen at whatever expression had seized my face. Heat pulsed through my temples, making my vision swim at the edges. I had a full ride. Each word dropped like a stone. The acceptance letter is still in my apartment. 4 years, tuition, room, board, engineering program, full scholarship. My mother's hands flew to her mouth. The oxygen machine behind my father's bed hissed and wheezed, filling the silence that stretched between us. I watched the color drain from her face again, watched her realize I'd kept that letter for 43 years. My father's hand reached for the bed controls, trying to elevate himself further. The motor whined as the bed lifted, bringing him nearly upright. Sweat beaded on his forehead from the effort of movement, but his jaw set in that stubborn line I'd inherited. "You never showed us that letter." The laugh that burst from my throat felt like broken glass. I turned away from them both, staring out the window at the parking lot 4 stories below. Cars glinted in the afternoon sun like scattered jewels. A family walked toward the entrance, a father carrying a small child on his shoulders while the mother pushed a stroller. The normalcy of it made something twist violently in my chest. "I brought it to dinner." My reflection in the glass showed a woman I barely recognized, jaw clenched, eyes hard. "June 3rd, 1978. You said we'd discuss it after we ate. Then Dad suggested we all drive up to look at lake properties that weekend instead." Behind me, I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath. The chair creaked as she shifted her weight. In the window's reflection, I saw her reach for my father's hand, but he pulled away from her, his face crumpling into something that might have been remorse, or might have been pain from his failing kidneys. "We looked at 12 properties that weekend." I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, feeling the vibration of the building's HVAC system humming through it. "You put the deposit down on property number 7, the one with the dock and the cedar trees. Monday morning, I told you I needed an answer about the scholarship. You said the fund was already allocated." The words hung in the air like smoke. I turned back to face them, crossing my arms over my chest to keep my hands from shaking. My mother had bent forward, her face buried in her hands again, but this time her crying came in loud, gasping sobs that shook her entire frame. The sound of it should have moved me, should have cracked through the ice that had formed around my heart. Instead, I felt only the same cold detachment. My father's hand trembled as he reached for the water cup on his bedside table. I watched him struggle with it, watched the plastic straw slip from his lips twice before he managed to take a sip. When he set it down, water dribbled onto his hospital gown, darkening the pale blue fabric. "Your mother needed—" he started. "Don't." I held up one hand, palm out. "Don't you dare make this about her needs." I moved to the small closet where they'd hung his clothes, yanking open the door with enough force to make it bang against the wall. The sound made my mother jump in her chair. Inside, I found his wallet in his jacket pocket, the leather worn smooth from decades of use. My hands worked automatically, pulling out credit cards, his insurance card, receipts folded into tiny squares. "What are you doing?" My father's voice cracked on the last word. Behind the receipts, I found what I was looking for, a photograph, edges soft with age. The lake house at sunset, my parents standing on the dock with drinks in their hands, their faces glowing with satisfaction. I'd seen this photo before, tucked away in various wallets and albums. But now I studied my mother's expression, the way her free hand rested possessively on the dock's railing, claiming ownership, claiming my future. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in my mother's careful script, "Our dream realized, June 2003. The month before I was supposed to start at Northwestern. The month the university financial aid office had called, confused about why my acceptance letter had gone unanswered. I'd been working double shifts at the diner that summer, saving every tip, believing my parents when they said the fund was temporarily tied up in investments. The photograph slipped from my fingers, floating down to land face up on the linoleum. My father's breathing grew ragged, each inhale a wet, laboring sound that filled the small room. A nurse passed by in the hallway outside, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The fluorescent lights above hummed their endless mechanical drone. I crouched down, my knees popping with the movement. 64 years old, and my body reminded me of it constantly now. All those years cleaning houses, scrubbing toilets, hauling vacuum cleaners up staircases in other people's homes. My hands bore the evidence. Knuckles swollen with arthritis, skin dried and cracked despite the lotions I religiously applied. These hands that should have been holding textbooks, typing papers, building something more. "Cynthia, please." My mother stood, her chair scraping backward. "Your father needs to rest. The doctors said he has maybe 3 months. I straightened, leaving the photograph where it had fallen. 3 months, and you thought now would be a good time to tell me you stole my entire future. My father tried to sit up higher in the bed. The movement triggered something, a spasm that rippled through his chest. His face contorted, lips pulling back from his teeth. The heart monitor's steady beeping accelerated, numbers climbing on the screen. My mother rushed to his side, fumbling for the call button. I stood frozen, watching. Part of me, some dark, ugly part I'd never acknowledged before, felt satisfied. Let him feel pain. Let him understand consequence. But then his hand clutched at his chest, and his eyes found mine across the bed. Not pleading, not apologizing, just watching me watch him suffer. The door burst open. 2 nurses swept in, one pushing a crash cart. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, adjusting oxygen levels. One of them, a young woman with her hair in a tight bun, gestured sharply toward the door. "Family needs to step out, now." My mother gathered her purse, her movements jerky with panic. She looked at me, eyes red-rimmed and desperate, silently begging me to follow. I picked up my own bag from the chair, hooked it over my shoulder. But I didn't move toward the door. Instead, I walked to the foot of my father's bed, my fingers wrapping around the cold metal railing. The nurses worked around me, one inserting a new IV while the other documented readings. My father's chest rose and fell, with mechanical precision now, aided by the oxygen mask they'd strapped across his face. His eyes had closed, but I knew he wasn't sleeping. I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the blanket. "Ma'am, you need to leave." The nurse with the bun touched my elbow, her grip firm, but not unkind. I shook her off, leaned forward, spoke loud enough that I knew he could hear me through whatever fog of pain and medication they'd given him. "I found the deed in your safe deposit box. You listed me as your next of kin, remember? The bank called me when you collapsed." My voice came out steady, cold. "The lake house is worth $1.2 million now. You bought it for $87,000. My college fund was $93,000. My mother made a sound, half gasp, half sob. She stood in the doorway, one hand pressed against the frame to hold herself upright. The nurse's grip on my elbow tightened. "Ma'am, I'm leaving." I pulled away, turning toward the door. But I paused next to my mother, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same Chanel No. 5 she'd worn my entire life. Expensive. Always expensive. "You spent my inheritance while I was still alive to see it." I adjusted my bag on my shoulder. I hope every sunset you watched from that dock was worth it. My mother's hand shot out, fingers closing around my wrist with surprising strength. Her manicured nails dug crescents into my skin, the pressure immediate and sharp. I looked down at where she gripped me, watched the tendons in her hand stand out like cables pulled taut. "Don't you dare walk away from me!" Her voice came out low, trembling with something between rage and desperation. I twisted my arm, but she held fast. Behind us, the monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The nurses had stopped moving, frozen in that particular way medical staff do when family conflict erupts in their sterile, controlled spaces. One of them took a step toward us, then stopped, clearly weighing whether to intervene. My mother's face had transformed. The careful makeup she'd applied that morning, even in crisis, she never forgot, had begun to crack. Foundation settled into the lines around her mouth. Her lipstick had worn away at the center, leaving a pale outline that made her look older, more fragile. But her eyes held nothing fragile. They blazed. "You think you understand what happened?" She pulled me closer, and I could feel the tremor in her grip, see the muscle jumping in her jaw. "You have no idea what we sacrificed." The laugh that came out of me felt like broken glass in my throat. I wrenched my arm free, the motion violent enough that she stumbled back a step. The nurse moved forward then, one hand out in a placating gesture that neither of us acknowledged. "Sacrificed?" I rubbed my wrist where red marks bloomed. "You want to talk about sacrifice?" But she was already talking, words spilling out faster now, her carefully maintained composure fragmenting. "Your father worked 70-hour weeks for 30 years. 30 years in that cramped office, coming home with his shoulders hunched, stress eating him alive. We never traveled, never bought anything we wanted. Everything went to you. Your piano lessons, your summer camps, your private tutors." I backed toward the door, my shoulder blades pressing against the frame. A doctor squeezed past me into the room, his attention immediately on my father. He checked the monitors, frowned at something on the screen, spoke in low tones to the nurses. None of them looked at us, but I knew they were listening. Hospital drama, the kind that probably got discussed later in break rooms over bitter coffee. "We thought—" My mother's voice cracked. She pressed her fingers to her lips, fighting for control. "We thought you'd get scholarships. You were so smart, Cynthia. Top of your class. We thought the fund would just be there, extra. We thought we deserved something for ourselves." The doctor was adjusting my father's IV now, his movements quick and efficient. My father's eyes had opened again, tracking the doctor's movements with the desperate focus of someone trying to maintain control of a situation spinning rapidly away from them. I pushed off from the doorframe, moved deeper into the hallway. My mother followed, her heels clicking on the linoleum in a rhythm that had punctuated my entire childhood. Click, 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 the sound of her walking through our house, through parent-teacher conferences, through my high school graduation where she'd smiled and waved and never once mentioned that my college fund had already been converted into lakefront property. "I didn't get scholarships." My voice came out flat now, all the heat drained away into something harder and colder. "I got student loans. $127,000 in student loans." She stopped walking, stood there in the middle of the hallway with fluorescent lights washing her out, making her look ghostly. A food service cart rattled past us. Someone's call button was chiming insistently from one of the nearby rooms. "We paid what we could." "You paid the minimum for 3 years, then stopped." I counted off on my fingers, each point a small, deliberate gesture. "I handled the rest. 43 years old before I paid them off. 43. While you sat on your deck drinking wine and watching boats go by. The tremor in her hands had spread to her whole body now. She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture that made her look smaller. For the first time, I noticed how thin she'd become, how the expensive blouse hung loose on her frame. Your father's sick. I know. I cut her off. Heart attack. Possibly another one coming based on what that doctor just looked at. I heard the nurse on the phone with cardiology while you were in the bathroom. Her face went white under the foundation. She reached out, found the wall, pressed her palm flat against it for support. The wedding ring on her finger caught the light. 3 carats, upgraded on their 40th anniversary. Paid for with what? More of my money? More carefully justified decisions made behind closed doors? Are you saying you won't help? Her voice had gone small, almost childlike. I looked at her. Really looked. Saw the woman who had braided my hair for school pictures, who had stayed up with me during finals week making coffee, who had cried at my wedding. Also saw the woman who had signed documents, transferred funds, made choices that had shaped the entire trajectory of my adult life. The cafeteria's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sterile blue-white glow that made the scattered tables look like islands in an antiseptic ocean. I walked past the coffee station, my shoes squeaking against the linoleum with each step, heading toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the parking lot. My mother followed 3 paces behind, her breathing audible, shallow, and quick. Outside, an ambulance pulled up to the emergency entrance, its lights spinning red and white patterns across the wet pavement. Rain had started while we'd been upstairs, turning the November afternoon darker than it should have been at 4 o'clock. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, felt the cold seep through my skin. My reflection stared back, ghostly and transparent, superimposed over the parking lot below. Behind me, my mother's reflection wavered, uncertain. I'm not saying I won't help. The words came out flat, measured. I watched my breath fog the window, a small circle of condensation that disappeared as quickly as it formed. I'm saying I need to understand what I'm helping. She moved closer, reaching out as if to touch my shoulder, then stopped. Her hand hovered in the space between us, fingers curled slightly inward. Through the reflection, I watched her withdraw the hand, tuck it against her chest. We made mistakes. Choices, I corrected, turning to face her directly now. You made choices, deliberate ones. The vacation home wasn't an impulse. It was licensed, insured, rented out for income. You ran it like a business. Her eyes shifted away, focusing on something past my shoulder. The ambulance had unloaded its patient, and the automatic doors were closing, swallowing the gurney and its attendants into the hospital's interior. When she finally met my gaze again, something had changed in her expression. A hardness I'd only seen a few times before, usually when she argued with my father. We deserved something. Her voice had gained an edge, defensive and sharp. 25 years working retail management, your father breaking his back in construction. We deserved one thing that was ours. I laughed, a short bark of sound that echoed off the empty cafeteria walls. A janitor pushing a mop bucket looked up, then quickly away, reading the tension in our postures. The chemical smell of floor cleaner drifted over, mixing with the coffee and fried food odors that permeated the space. And I deserved to start my life drowning. I stepped closer to her, watching her instinctively step back, her hip bumping against a chair. Every decision I made for 15 years was shaped by that debt. Took a job I hated because it paid more. Stayed 5 extra years to maximize the salary? Put off having kids until we could afford it? Then discovered we'd waited too long? Her face crumpled at that, the makeup creasing along the lines around her eyes and mouth. She knew about the fertility treatments, the failed attempts, the eventual acceptance. But I'd never said it out loud before, never connected those losses directly to their decision. That's not fair. Fair? The word came out louder than I'd intended. 2 nurses at a nearby table glanced over, their conversation pausing. I lowered my voice, forcing it back to that measured tone. You want to discuss fair now? My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, saw Gerald's name on the screen. My husband, calling from the office where he was covering my afternoon appointments. I declined the call, sent a quick text instead. Still at hospital. Call you soon. When I looked up, my mother had moved to one of the tables, lowered herself into a plastic chair that creaked under her weight. She'd aged a decade in the past hour. The tremor in her hands had become more pronounced, making her wedding ring rattle slightly against the table's laminated surface. The insurance won't cover everything, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He needs bypass surgery, maybe 2, depending on what they find. The deductible alone is $20,000. Then there's recovery, medications, follow-up care. We don't have it. I remained standing, my back still to the windows. The parking lot lights had begun clicking on, sensor activated by the gathering darkness. Their orange glow reflected off rain-slicked cars, creating halos of light that looked almost beautiful if you didn't think too hard about why you were here seeing them. The vacation house has a reverse mortgage. She cut me off, anticipating the question. We took it out 3 years ago. There's no equity left. The information settled over me like a physical weight. I pulled out the chair across from her, sat down slowly. The table between us was scarred with scratches, years of trays and utensils scoring the surface. Someone had carved initials into one corner, JM plus TR, surrounded by a lopsided heart. What else? I asked. She closed her eyes, and a single tear tracked down her cheek, cutting a line through her foundation. Credit cards, maxed out. We were trying to pay them down, but your father's hours got cut last year. I'm part-time now, barely making enough to cover the basics. The full picture assembled itself in my mind like a puzzle I hadn't wanted to complete. The expensive clothes were old, carefully maintained. The car I'd seen them driving last Christmas was 5 years old, not new. The cruise they'd mentioned had been a timeshare presentation gift, not something they'd purchased. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Gerald. Your 5 p.m. called to reschedule. Take your time. Love you. I typed back, love you too, then set the phone face down on the table. How much do you need? The question emerged before I'd fully decided to ask it, but once spoken, it hung there between us, impossible to take back. My mother's hands flew to her mouth, covering it like she could stuff the answer back inside before speaking it. Her shoulders began to shake, a tremor that started small and built into something that made the plastic chair creak beneath her. I watched her fingers press white against her lips, watched the way her wedding ring, thinner than I remembered, worn down by decades, caught the fluorescent light. 37,000. The words came out muffled behind her hands. Medical bills from your father's procedure last year. The deductible was, we couldn't. Her voice fractured completely. I stood up, walked to the vending machine in the corner. My legs moved automatically while my brain processed numbers, calculations, restructuring budgets I'd already restructured twice this year. The machine hummed and rattled as I fed it dollar bills, punched buttons for water bottles neither of us would probably drink. The plastic thunked into the retrieval slot with a hollow sound that echoed in the small space. When I returned to the table, I set one bottle in front of her and kept one for myself. The condensation was already forming, making the plastic slick under my palm. I twisted the cap off with more force than necessary, the crack of the seal breaking loud enough that an orderly passing in the hallway glanced in our direction. "I can't give you $37,000. I said it clearly, watching her face crumple further. "But I can give you 15 now, and we'll set up a payment plan for the rest. Through me, not through some predatory lender charging you 20% interest." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "There are conditions." I pulled my phone out, opened the banking app with fingers that had steadied now that I'd made the decision. "You sell the vacation house, whatever you can get for it, even with the reverse mortgage. You close the credit cards except one for emergencies, and I mean actual emergencies. And you both see a financial counselor, weekly, for at least 6 months. My mother nodded so vigorously her glasses slipped down her nose. She pushed them back up with trembling fingers, leaving a smudge on one lens that caught the light like a tiny prism. "And therapy." The words came harder now. "Both of you need to talk to someone about why you made these choices, why you took my college fund. Money that was mine, that I earned through scholarships and work study, just to make it enough, and spent it on something you couldn't afford to maintain." The vending machine kicked on again, its motor grinding through the silence between us. I completed the transfer on my phone, watching the numbers shift and reshape my carefully maintained savings account. $15,000 gone in the time it took to authenticate with my fingerprint and confirm the transaction. My retirement fund would take the hit next month when I made the first payment plan installment. "I'm not doing this because you deserve it." I set the phone down, screen up so she could see the confirmation if she wanted. "I'm doing this because you're my parents, and because leaving you to drown doesn't make what happened any less wrong. But the relationship we had before? That's gone. We're rebuilding from here, and it's going to look different." My mother reached across the table, her hand hovering over mine like she was afraid to actually make contact. I didn't pull away, but I didn't reach back either. After a moment, she withdrew, wrapping both hands around the water bottle instead. Her knuckles stood out sharp beneath papery skin, and I noticed for the first time how much older she looked than 68. The stress had carved lines I hadn't seen at Christmas, hadn't noticed because I'd been too busy being angry to really look. "Your father doesn't know I'm telling you any of this." She twisted the cap off her water bottle, the plastic crackling. "He wanted to handle it himself. Said we'd already taken enough from you." He was right about that part. I stood, collected my purse from the back of the chair. My blazer had wrinkled during the conversation, the linen creasing across the back in a way that would need steaming before tomorrow's court appearance. "I'll email you the counselor information tonight. Same woman Gerald and I saw during his deployment. She's good with financial trauma." The phrase hung in the air between us. Financial trauma. Naming it made it real in a way the anger hadn't. Transformed it from a personal betrayal into something that could be examined, treated, possibly healed. My mother's face shifted as she heard it, recognition dawning slowly. Story block 1010. 6 months later, Cynthia stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office on the 19th floor, watching the sunrise paint downtown Baltimore in shades of amber and rose. The skyline stretched before her, familiar buildings transformed by morning light into something that felt newly claimed. Her reflection stared back from the glass, a woman who had rebuilt herself from the wreckage of betrayal into something stronger, sharper at the edges, but with a core of carefully protected softness. The partnership announcement had come through 3 weeks ago. Her name now appeared on the firm's letterhead, etched in raised lettering on business cards stacked in boxes on her mahogany desk. She ran her fingers across one of the cards, feeling the texture of her achievement made tangible through pressed cotton paper. 26 years of work, of proving herself in courtrooms and conference rooms, of building a reputation case by case, until even the senior partners couldn't deny what she'd earned. Behind her, the door clicked open. Gerald entered, carrying 2 paper cups from the cafe downstairs, steam curling from the lids. He'd driven up from Virginia for the weekend, making the trip more frequently now that things between them had settled into a new rhythm. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them expected. Not quite romance anymore, but deeper than simple friendship, bound by shared history and mutual respect that survived even when passion faded. "Traffic's already backing up on the harbor bridge," he said, setting 1 cup beside her laptop. "You sure about the house viewing at 10? She nodded, watching cars thread through the streets below like blood cells through arteries, the city's pulse visible from this height. The condo she'd been renting since the divorce served its purpose, but ownership called to her now with a different urgency. Not the sprawling vacation property her parents had stolen her future to purchase, but something modest, something entirely hers, paid for with money she'd earned through her own sweat and strategic brilliance in the courtroom. Her phone buzzed against the desk surface. A text from her mother appeared on the screen, the weekly check-in they'd negotiated as part of their careful reconstruction. The messages stayed brief, factual updates about the financial counseling sessions, about the modest apartment her parents now rented in a suburb, neither fancy nor shameful. The vacation house had sold in April, the proceeds divided between debt repayment and Cynthia's reimbursement. The money sat in her savings account, untouched, transformed from college fund to down payment fund across the span of 3 decades. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out the framed photograph she'd placed there last month. Her younger self smiled from behind glass, cap, and gown pristine, holding a law degree earned through student loans and weekend shifts at the university library. That woman had clawed her way through obstacles her parents' betrayal had created, had built a career despite, rather than because of family support. The anger had mellowed into something more complex. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that people were capable of both tremendous love and tremendous selfishness, sometimes simultaneously. Gerald moved beside her at the window, his shoulder nearly touching hers. They stood in companionable silence, watching the city wake. A construction crane swung slowly across the harbor, building something new where old warehouses once crumbled. Rebirth and renovation, the eternal cycle of cities and lives, tearing down what no longer served to make space for what might flourish. "You nervous about tonight?" he asked. The reception for new partners started at 7, champagne and networking in the building's marble lobby. She'd bought a dress for the occasion, deep burgundy silk that made her feel powerful and elegant. Her first purchase after the partnership announcement, a celebration she'd granted herself without guilt or hesitation. "Excited," she said, and meant it. Terrified, but excited. The feeling reminded her of standing outside the LSAT testing center at 21, stomach churning with possibility and dread. She'd carried that same electric anticipation through bar exam results, through her first solo trial, through every threshold that marked transformation. Fear and joy braided together into the rope she'd climbed to reach this height. This view, this moment of standing in an office with her name on the door. Her phone buzzed again. This time, A text from her mother included a photograph. Her father in their small garden, hands dirty from planting tomatoes, his smile cautious but genuine. The image felt like an offering, a bridge built from pixels and hope. She studied his face, searching for the man who'd stolen from her, and finding instead someone who looked diminished, humbled, working to grow something honest from soil he'd poisoned. Cynthia picked up her coffee, let the warmth seep into her palms. Tomorrow, she'd respond to her mother. Tonight, she'd celebrate her partnership. This morning, she'd view houses and imagine which walls would hold her future. The calendar stretched ahead, marked with court dates and dinner plans, and the ordinary architecture of a life rebuilt on her own terms. Not perfect, not without scars, but undeniably, powerfully hers. She turned from the window, set the photograph back in its drawer, and pulled up the house listings on her laptop. The first property showed a brick townhouse with a small backyard, space enough for the garden she'd always imagined planting. She clicked through images of hardwood floors and updated kitchens, rooms waiting to be filled with the life she'd choose rather than the one chosen for her. Gerald leaned over her shoulder, pointing at the listing's features. They discussed square footage and mortgage rates, the practical details of building something solid. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away morning shadows, illuminating everything with stark and beautiful clarity. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.